I'm Cynthia Harper, 68 years old, and I still remember the morning my son and his wife carried the first of their moving boxes through my front door. The air in my home seemed to change that day, subtle at first, like a cool breeze drifting in from somewhere unfamiliar. I had no way of knowing that the same house my late husband and I built together, board by board, would soon feel like it belonged to someone else entirely. What began as a welcome arrangement would turn into something far different, something that would push me to protect more than just the walls around me. By the time I realized what was happening, they had already taken the first steps toward erasing me. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to push you aside. I've lived in this house in Glenwood for nearly 4 decades. My husband Henry and I bought the plot when Michael was just a toddler, back when the street was lined with young maples and the summers felt endless. We poured everything into it, evenings after work spent painting, trim weekends digging out space for the garden, and a fall where we planted 3 apple trees that still bloom every spring. Every scuff on the kitchen counter has a story. Every creak in the hallway floorboards is a memory. Even after Henry passed, this house was my anchor, the place I could feel his presence most. Michael grew up here knowing the value of care and effort. I raised him to believe in kindness, in taking responsibility, and respecting the work someone else has put into something. I never imagined I'd have to remind him of that as an adult. Life had taken him to the city, to a job in finance, and then to meeting Lauren. She was polished, ambitious, and came from a family where style often mattered more than sentiment. I noticed that difference the first time she walked through my door, her eyes scanning the living room like she was taking measurements. When they told me they needed a place to stay while looking for their own home, I agreed without hesitation. I thought it might be nice to have company again, to fill the house with more voices and laughter. At first, it was small things, Lauren replacing my old kitchen radio with a sleek device that responded to her voice saying it would streamline the atmosphere. Then the floral curtains in the dining room disappeared, replaced with pale linen panels she called more neutral. I told myself these were harmless changes, the kind of compromises families make when living under one roof. But a few weeks in, the compromises became directions. Lauren asked if I'd mind moving my things into the smaller back bedroom so she could use the guest suite as her home office. She said it would be temporary, just until she settled into her work schedule. I agreed, thinking it was easier to go along than to make an issue of it. The truth is, I wanted to keep the peace. Still, there was a moment late one night as I sat on the edge of that smaller bed when I realized the pictures on the walls were the only sign left that this was my home. Not long after, I overheard a conversation in the kitchen between Michael and Lauren. Her voice was light, almost pleasant, but the words cut sharp. She said the house didn't feel like theirs, that it was as though they were guests in someone else's memory. Michael didn't correct her. He didn't remind her whose name was on the deed or that I had lived here since before they met. He just kept quiet. That was the moment I understood I wasn't simply sharing my home. I was slowly being moved out of it, one decision at a time. Lauren's changes to the house became bolder as the weeks went on. She no longer paused to ask if I minded before moving things or replacing them. One morning, I went to the pantry to get flour for bread, only to find the shelves stripped of the arrangement I'd kept for years. My labeled jars and rows of canned vegetables had been replaced with identical glass containers lined in perfect symmetry. She called it streamlining, but to me, it was as if the order I'd built was erased in a single sweep. The remarks began soon after. They were never sharp enough to be called insults, yet always carried an edge. She would mention how much fresher the air was with her diffuser running, or how she could concentrate better without the sound of the evening news drifting in from the living room. I knew she meant my habits without her saying so. Even when I walked in to find her wiping the glass doors to the back porch, she kept her tone light, noting that fingerprints made her anxious. I recognized the smudges she was cleaning, marks left by my hand when I leaned to water the plants outside. Little by little, she adjusted more than the decor. She shaped the atmosphere of the house in a way that felt deliberate. One evening, as I stood at the counter brushing dirt from my gardening shoes, she called across the kitchen to suggest we create guidelines for shared spaces. She had printed the list out: no personal belongings in the living room, no kitchen use without immediate cleanup, no laundry room access during her office hours, and no strong scents in shared areas. Each point seemed aimed squarely at me. I didn't challenge her. I took the paper, folded it neatly, and tucked it away in a drawer where I kept things I wasn't ready to throw out but couldn't bring myself to use. 2 Sundays later, I spent the morning trimming hedges out front. It was one of the few tasks I knew Lauren would leave alone. She never liked getting dirt under her nails. When I came in for a glass of iced tea, I stopped short just outside the kitchen. Her voice carried that soft, careful tone she used when delivering something final. She told Michael she needed more space to truly settle in, that having someone always here limited their sense of growth. Then came the words that chilled me. She said the house felt like being guests in someone else's memory. Michael didn't remind her whose memory that was. He didn't speak my name at all. His quiet answer was simply, "I understand." I stepped back before either of them saw me and returned to my room. That night, lying in bed, I tried to recall the last time Michael and I had laughed together, but the memory didn't come. It struck me then that this wasn't just about furniture or rules, it was about my place in their lives. From that night on, I began keeping a slim folder beside my bed. In it were the deed to the house, the will Henry left me, my most recent bank statements, and a small envelope marked originals. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but I knew enough to keep them close. A few mornings later, just after finishing the laundry, I heard Lauren speaking sharply into the phone in the hallway. I waited in the corner until she passed, catching only pieces of her words. She said they needed to move forward before she changes her mind, and that she still thinks the accounts are in her name. When she saw me, her face smoothed instantly into a smile, asking if I needed help with the towels. I told her no. That afternoon, I studied my bank statements more closely. One account showed a routing number I didn't recognize. I called the bank and asked for confirmation, giving every piece of identification they needed. The representative paused before telling me the account had been closed the previous month and consolidated into a trust I'd never heard of, the Harper family holdings. I hung up without responding, sitting on the edge of my bed until the light shifted on the wall. I skipped dinner that night, heating soup in the microwave and eating alone. The house was silent, though I could hear faint music coming from somewhere. It was the kind of quiet that felt intentional. The next day, with Michael gone early for work, Lauren met me in the kitchen. She said she was having a few friends over for brunch that weekend and thought it might be easier if I stayed with my friend Joanna for a couple of days. Her tone was calm, her eyes fixed on her laptop as she spoke. I told her I already had plans and went outside to tend the roses. When I returned, the front door was locked. My key didn't work. I tried the bell, knocked twice, and walked around to the back, but the sliding door was locked too. I could hear music inside, turned up just enough to blur footsteps. After several minutes, Michael opened the door. He said Lauren had changed the locks, that it wasn't personal, just until things settled down. When I asked where he expected me to go, he didn't answer. I walked down the driveway, still holding my gardening gloves. 3 blocks away, I pulled over the car and sat there trying to catch my breath. By nightfall, I had checked into a small roadside motel. The carpet smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, but the lock worked, and for the first time in weeks, the space felt like mine. I laid the folder on the bed and began going through each page, marking dates, account numbers, and anything that looked out of place. Lauren's words from the hallway replayed in my mind. She hadn't expected me to notice, and she certainly hadn't expected me to act. That weekend, I called Trina, the daughter of an old friend, who now worked as an elder rights attorney. I didn't give details over the phone, only asked if she could come by. She arrived the next morning with a notepad and listened quietly as I told her everything. The changes in the house, the bank account, the trust, and being locked out. When I finished, she said this wasn't misunderstanding. It was a plan. She promised to pull property and financial records first thing Monday. As she left, she told me to keep every piece of paper I had safe. I locked the folder in my suitcase that night and placed it beside the bed, knowing this was no longer about coexisting. It was about protecting what was mine. The motel room was small, but it was the first place in months where I could close the door and know it would stay locked. I set the folder on the round table by the window and began sorting through the papers one more time. Bank statements, the deed, Henry's will, and a few older documents I had almost forgotten about were laid out in neat stacks. I circled dates that didn't match my records and wrote notes in the margins. The more I compared, the more it became clear that the changes to my accounts hadn't been recent or sudden. They had been happening quietly for months. On Sunday morning, Trina returned with 2 large binders, her notepad, and a look that told me she had already found something. She opened the first binder to a copy of the property transfer, filed just weeks earlier. My name was no longer on the title by itself. The Harper Family Holdings Trust had been added as the owner, with a shaky version of my signature on the form. I knew instantly it wasn't mine. She pointed to the notary's stamp, then to a printed address in small type along the margin. She explained that she planned to speak with the notary in person to confirm whether the document had been signed in her presence. The second binder held financial records pulled from the bank and other institutions. She traced her finger along a series of withdrawals, each, just under the reporting threshold, moved into an account under a business-style name controlled by Michael. The pattern was deliberate, steady, and impossible to explain away as a mistake. She didn't need to tell me what it meant. We spent most of the day reviewing each page until my eyes blurred. I brewed coffee in the small drip pot the motel provided and poured it into the paper cups by the sink. Trina didn't slow down. She spoke about filing an emergency injunction to freeze any further changes to the trust or my accounts. If we acted quickly, we could prevent them from selling or transferring the house. By late afternoon, she closed the binders and sat back. "If we move forward, things are going to get personal," she said quietly. "They'll try to make this about you, not the documents. They'll say you're confused or unstable." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the warning in it. I told her I understood. That night after she left, I opened the folder again. One page stood out that I hadn't noticed before, a yellowed sheet of paper from an old ledger Henry had kept before his surgery. In his handwriting, under a list of assets, he had written, "If anything happens to me, Cynthia keeps the house. Non-negotiable." It wasn't a legal will, but it was his clear intention. I slipped it into a plastic sleeve and set it on top of the stack for Trina to see. The next morning, Trina called before 8. The notary had admitted that the signature wasn't witnessed in person. Lauren had brought the document to her, claiming I'd signed it at home. It was enough for Trina to file the injunction that same day. She met me at the courthouse with the paperwork, and within hours, a judge had signed the order. Nothing in the trust could be altered until a full hearing was held. That evening, I received a brief message from Michael asking to meet. He didn't apologize, only said we should talk and that things had gone too far. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the coffee shop down the street from the motel the next morning and waited for Trina. She brought another folder, this one filled with the documents we would submit to the court. She spoke in a measured way, explaining each step, each piece of evidence, and how it would fit into the case. We spent the following days gathering more. Old tax returns showed a rental cabin Henry and I had bought years ago had been moved into the same trust without my knowledge. The signature on that transfer matched the one on the house deed, the same shaky imitation. Later, Trina showed me surveillance images from a convenience store ATM. Michael was there withdrawing cash from the trust account he claimed was managed only by Lauren. When she laid the photograph in front of me, I didn't say anything. I just looked at the grainy image of my son in a gray hoodie, eyes down, moving with practiced ease. Trina tapped the edge of the photo and said we now had enough to reverse the trust entirely. But she also reminded me that this would leave them no room to back away quietly. I nodded. 2 days before the hearing, I drove past the house. The roses in the front yard had grown tall, brushing against the porch rail. The porch light was out. Through the front window, I caught a glimpse of Lauren moving boxes into the den. I didn't stop or knock. I just drove away. That night, Trina and I sat at the motel table going over my testimony. She reminded me to stick to the facts, not to let emotion take over, and to speak plainly. I told her I understood. I already knew what I needed to say. When the morning came, I wore the pale blue blouse I had kept pressed in the back of my closet since Henry's retirement party. In the mirror, I smoothed the sleeves and held my shoulders steady before leaving. I wanted to be seen as present, not as someone asking for pity. The courthouse was quiet when we arrived. Lauren sat on the far side with her attorney, a stack of files at her elbow. Michael came in minutes later, but didn't look my way. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Trina began with the property records, then the bank statements, then the photographs. She presented Henry's handwritten note, last reading the single sentence aloud. Lauren's attorney tried to have it excluded, calling it sentimental, but the judge allowed it. When it was my turn, I stood and told the court how long I had lived in the house, how Henry and I built it, and how I discovered the changes without my consent. I spoke evenly, keeping my eyes on the judge. By the end of the session, there was no ruling yet, but the injunction was extended. The judge ordered a forensic review of the signatures before the next hearing. As we left, Michael walked past without speaking. Lauren glanced over her shoulder once, then kept moving. Trina joined me at the top of the courthouse steps. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew this was far from over. The morning after we left the courthouse, Trina called just after 8. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the weight behind it. The handwriting expert had already turned in a preliminary report. The signature on the deed transfer wasn't mine. The slant and pressure didn't match, and the flow of the pen showed hesitation in places where my hand would have been sure. Paired with the notary's statement and Michael's own bank activity, it was enough to show the forgery wasn't a mistake. The court scheduled the next hearing for 10 days later. In the meantime, Trina advised me to let the case build quietly. She handled the filings while I settled into the rhythm of the motel. Days started to blend together, mornings with coffee by the window, afternoons sorting through boxes I'd brought from the garage before the locks changed. In one bin tucked beneath old recipe cards and insurance papers, I found an envelope from my mother. Inside was a short note in her handwriting and a check she'd given me years ago for when things feel too far gone. I held on to it without quite knowing why. 5 days in a plain envelope with no return address arrived at the motel. Inside was a single sheet of paper typed, telling me I could have kept this private and that I'd made my choice. There was no name, but I didn't need one. I read it once, folded it, and dropped it in the trash. The following morning, Trina arrived with new paperwork. She'd spoken with the attorney who had drafted an earlier version of Henry's will. He agreed to provide a sworn statement confirming that Henry had made it clear the house would remain in my name for as long as I chose, and that Michael and Lauren were only to benefit if I allowed it. It wasn't enough to overturn the trust on its own, but it gave the court more context. That afternoon, we sat on the motel bedspread, organizing the case files. Trina paused and asked what I planned to do if the court returned the house to me. I didn't have an answer. For months, I'd focused on not being erased. I hadn't thought about what came next. I told her I'd think about it. 2 days later, we received the judge's interim ruling. He found sufficient evidence of forgery and financial misconduct to freeze all assets connected to the Harper Family Holdings Trust until trial. They couldn't move money, sell property, or make changes without court approval. It wasn't the end, but it was a firm step. That evening, I stood at the motel window, watching the streetlights blink on. For the first time in months, I felt still. I opened a small notebook I hadn't touched in years and wrote a single line. You don't have to win everything. You just have to stop giving yourself away. The day before the next hearing, Trina and I reviewed our statements. She told me Michael and Lauren had hired another lawyer, filed a motion to dismiss the forgery claim, and even tried to suggest I was unfit to manage my affairs. They're cornered, she said, and they're scrambling. I told her I didn't want revenge. I wanted the line redrawn. On the morning of the hearing, I put on a navy dress I'd worn to Michael's college graduation. Back then, I'd clapped the loudest when they called his name. Now I was walking into a courtroom to prove what he'd done. Lauren sat stiff in her chair, her attorney murmuring beside her. Michael wasn't there. Instead, he'd sent a written statement claiming I'd misunderstood that Lauren was only protecting the family assets and that I was too emotional to manage the estate after Henry died. The judge opened with a summary of the evidence so far, the forged signatures, the frozen accounts, and the sworn affidavits. He denied the motion to dismiss. Then Trina took the floor. She built the case piece by piece, showing that this was not confusion, but a calculated transfer of my rights and property without consent. She ended by reading Henry's handwritten note from the back of a cookbook. Make sure Cynthia has the house. It's hers. It always was. When Lauren's turn came, her lawyer shifted the tone, saying she had acted out of concern for me, that the trust was meant to stabilize the estate. But when the judge asked directly who had signed the deed, she hesitated. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled. She finally said she had assumed Michael handled it and that she wasn't sure of the details. The judge called a recess. Trina and I sat in silence until we were called back. When he returned, the judge ruled the transfer invalid due to forgery. The trust would be dissolved, the house returned to my name, and an investigation opened into the handling of the estate, including Michael's withdrawals. He also ordered that any future legal or financial actions involving me would require court approval from now on. Outside, the sun was bright on the courthouse steps. Trina told me we'd need to follow through on the financial audits, but for now, I just wanted to walk forward on my own. The fight over the house was ending, but another decision was already forming in my mind, one that would shape what I did next. 3 days after the ruling, I unlocked the front door to my house for the first time in months. The key turned easily, but the air inside felt different. The walls were still the sage green Henry and I had chosen years ago, and the light still poured in through the front windows in the same morning slant. Yet the space no longer carried the warmth I remembered. Lauren's touches were everywhere. Brass handles on the kitchen cabinets, a chandelier that hung too low in the hallway, framed photographs that didn't include me. On the hallway shelf, I noticed a family portrait where my face had once been beside Michael's, now cropped out and replaced with a vase. I didn't move anything that first night. Instead, I made up the bed in the guest room using the old quilt Henry and I had stitched together in our first years here. Sleeping there felt less like returning to a familiar place and more like finding a small corner that still belonged to me. In the morning, I walked slowly through each room without making notes or lists. I let my eyes settle on the changes one by one, absorbing them quietly. In the living room, tucked in the corner of a bookshelf, I found a small shoebox. Inside were envelopes, loan papers, and a copy of my life insurance policy. The most recent amendment named Michael as the sole beneficiary. The handwriting in the margin numbers and brief notes was Lauren's. I called Trina immediately. She asked if I had signed any changes to my policy in the past year. When I told her no, she asked me to send her photographs of every page. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Michael. His tone was calm, almost measured. He said he was sorry for how things had unfolded, that it wasn't right to let the house become more important than family harmony. I didn't call back. That evening, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Michael used to finish his homework, where Henry spread the newspaper, where I once sat alone, wondering when things had started to shift. The next day, I met Trina at the courthouse. I handed her 2 signed documents. The first revoked the power of attorney I had given Michael years ago. The second was a new trust agreement that removed both him and Lauren entirely. The successor trustee was a local foundation that provided legal aid and housing assistance to older women displaced from their homes. Trina read the documents over carefully, then placed them in her case file without comment. Back at the house, I began to pack. Not because anyone was forcing me out, but because I wanted to decide for myself what stayed and what left. I chose the rocking chair from the sunroom, the bird feeder from the back porch, and the photograph of Henry holding Michael as a baby. The brass handles and crystal chandelier stayed behind. A few days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox, thick cream-colored with no return address. Inside was an invitation for dinner with a short note in Lauren's handwriting, "Let's talk like family." I considered ignoring it, but something in the timing made me decide otherwise. I chose black slacks and a pale blouse for the evening, not to impress, but to make my intentions clear. Trina offered to join me, but I told her I needed to face them alone. The restaurant was modern and sleek with marble counters and polished steel fixtures. Michael stood when I approached the table. Lauren didn't. Her eyes stayed on her water glass until the waiter came by. We made small talk at first about the weather and Michael's work schedule. Then, Lauren folded her hands and said they thought it was time to find a way forward, that courts shouldn't define family relationships. Her real purpose came next. She explained they were refinancing the house and that it would be simpler if I transferred the deed to them outright. In exchange, they would consider adding my name to a shared investment account Michael had started using the remainder of Henry's retirement fund. I didn't answer right away. I let the quiet sit between us until Michael shifted in his seat. When I spoke, I told them the house was already placed in a new trust, one they had no part of. I added that the investment account had already been reviewed by my attorney and that the withdrawals Michael had made fell outside his expired authority. Lauren's eyes widened. Michael's fork slipped against his plate. I stood, thanked the waiter, and walked toward the exit. At the door, I turned just long enough to tell them not to contact me directly again. Any future matters would go through Trina. The next morning, Trina called to say Lauren's attorney had reached out to her office requesting a meeting. She didn't sound surprised. I went for a walk around the small lake where Michael and I used to feed the ducks when he was young. The water was still with only the occasional ripple. That afternoon, I packed the last of my belongings from the house, the ones I had placed in storage months before. This time, I left by choice, not by force. That night, I made a simple dinner in the kitchen, pasta and vegetables with a glass of iced tea. The space was quiet, but without the edge it had carried before. Before going to bed, I lit a small candle in the living room, not out of tradition, but to see the soft light play on the walls one last time. Whatever happened next, the house no longer held power over me. 2 mornings after I left the house for the last time, an envelope arrived in my mailbox at the small cottage I had just closed on. The handwriting on the front was one I recognized instantly. Michael's. Inside, a short letter said he was sorry for how things had turned out, that he had been caught up in circumstances, and that he hoped I might be willing to meet at a diner we had gone to when he was a boy. There was no mention of Lauren, no detailed explanation, just a request. I read it twice before setting it on the table. I called Trina the next day. She told me it was my choice whether to meet him, and that if I did, I should walk in prepared for anything. 3 days later, I slid into a booth at the far end of the diner. The red leather seats and chrome trim looked just as they had years ago. Michael came in late, glancing around before spotting me. He didn't try to hug me, only sat across from me and ordered coffee. He started slowly saying he thought things would feel calmer once I had moved out. But the house had stayed cold, even with just him and Lauren in it. He admitted he hadn't looked closely at the trust papers or the account numbers, relying on Lauren's word. His eyes dropped when he mentioned her. When I asked if they were still together, he paused, then nodded. He said she spent more time at work now that their conversations were about money and schedules, not much else. I asked him what the last real moment of warmth he remembered was. After a long pause, he said it was a snowstorm when he was 9, when we baked cinnamon rolls by candlelight after the power went out. He smiled faintly as he said it. We finished our coffee in silence. When the check came, he paid in cash and left without making plans to meet again. The following morning, I met Trina at her office to sign the final paperwork making the trust irrevocable. The house, 2 smaller properties I had purchased quietly, and the investment dividends from Henry's portfolio were now committed to a charitable foundation. Its purpose was to provide transitional housing for women over 60 who had been forced from their homes by family or circumstance. Trina slid the documents into her case and said she thought it was one of the most purposeful uses of an estate she had seen. In the weeks that followed, the cottage began to feel like my own. It was small. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, but there were no shared walls. No one watching when I came or went. No one rearranging the space without asking. I received a progress report from the foundation's director, saying 2 women had already moved into emergency housing through the program. One of them had sent a handwritten note thanking the organization for a place where she could lock the door at night. I kept the letter on the kitchen counter for a few days before placing it in a folder with the trust documents. Lauren contacted me once by email. The wording was careful, saying she had learned of the change in the trust and thought we might revisit the arrangement. I didn't reply. A week later, Michael called. His voice was rougher this time. He said he had seen an article about the foundation, complete with photographs of the first housing unit. He told me people he knew had called it admirable. Then he said quietly that he now understood why I had chosen not to come back. That afternoon, Trina and I met to discuss the next phase, the purchase of an old roadside motel on the edge of town that could be converted into additional housing units. She showed me the inspection report and her notes on needed repairs. The paint was peeling, and the roof would need work, but the structure was sound. I agreed it could be turned into something welcoming. By the end of the month, we walked the property together. The air inside smelled of dust and disuse, but I could picture what it might become: small rooms with warm lighting, a shared lounge with bookshelves, and a garden out back. One corner room had a window facing the mountains. I imagined someone standing there taking in the view, knowing they were safe. Renovations began 2 weeks later, helped by donations that came in after a local news segment about the project. They called it Harper House. I hadn't asked for that, but I didn't object. Michael and Lauren had moved away by then. I heard about it in passing from a neighbor. One afternoon, another envelope arrived, no return address, just a few lines saying, "I think I see things more clearly now. I'm sorry for how it ended. I hope you're well." I placed it in a drawer with the first letter and left it there. A few days later, I met one of the new residents, a woman named Gloria. She carried a red thermos and a paperback wherever she went. One evening, as we worked in the garden behind the main building, she said it felt good to be somewhere no one asked her to make herself smaller. I told her this space was meant for women like her. That night, I sat by my own window with a cup of tea watching the light fade through the trees. I thought about how far things had shifted. Once I had feared being shut out of a house I helped build. Now I was helping to build spaces for others to begin again. Spring arrived quietly, the kind that lingered in cool mornings and stretched daylight a little longer each evening. By then, the renovations at Harper House were moving at a steady pace. Fresh paint covered the worn siding, and new windows had been installed in most of the rooms. The garden out back was taking shape, with neat rows of soil ready for planting. Each visit I walked the halls, noting the small changes: a repaired doorframe, polished floors, light fixtures that warmed the space without being harsh. One afternoon, I arrived to find Trina standing outside with a clipboard speaking to a contractor about the final phase of work. She waved me over and handed me a set of keys to the west wing of the building. "It's ready for you to see," she said. Inside, the rooms were furnished simply: a bed with a quilt folded at the end, a dresser, and a chair by the window. The space felt clean, not just in the physical sense, but in the way a fresh start does. In the corner room that faced the mountains, I stopped for a moment. The view stretched across the valley dotted with early blooms. "This one will go fast," Trina said behind me. I nodded, picturing someone sitting in that chair with the morning sun on their face, knowing they had a door they could lock and a place to call theirs. That evening, after the contractors had left, I walked through the garden with Gloria. She told me she'd been reading in the afternoons while the air was still cool, that she liked hearing the sound of someone working in the distance. "It means things are being fixed," she said. I understood exactly what she meant. A week later, a letter arrived at the cottage. There was no return address, but the handwriting was Michael's. The note was short. He said he thought he understood things better, now that he was sorry for how it had ended, and that he hoped I was well. I folded it once and placed it in the same drawer as his earlier letter, leaving it unopened after that. The first residents moved into the renovated wing at the end of the month. I came by to welcome them, not with speeches, just with a pot of coffee and a plate of biscuits. One woman, her hands still marked with the faint lines of years in factory work, told me it had been a long time since she'd had a room to herself. Another simply said, "It's quiet here," as if that alone was enough. In the days that followed, I found myself spending more time at Harper House. I planted herbs in the garden beds, with Gloria helped arrange donated books in the common room, and worked with Trina to finalize plans for the last phase of construction. Each task felt purposeful, a piece of something larger than either of us. One afternoon, as I was leaving, I saw Michael standing by the edge of the parking lot. He wasn't close enough for conversation, and he didn't try to approach. He gave a brief nod before turning back toward his car. I watched him drive away without waving. Back at the cottage that evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap and a mug of tea in my hands. The air was cool, carrying the scent of new grass. The quiet felt different now, not the silence of being shut out, but the calm that comes from choosing where you stand. By the following week, the final inspection was scheduled. Trina called to confirm the date and mentioned that once it passed, the last of the rooms could be opened. There was no rush in her voice, just the steady assurance of someone who knew the work was nearly done. I told her I would be there when the inspector arrived. That night, I wrote a single line in my notebook. "A door that opens when you turn the key is worth more than a house filled with strangers." I closed the book and set it aside, knowing the next chapter was already waiting. The morning of the final inspection was bright, with a thin layer of dew still clinging to the grass when I arrived at Harper House. Trina was already there, standing by the front steps with a quiet smile. The inspector walked the halls, tested the locks, and checked the wiring. It didn't take long before he signed the papers, shook Trina's hand, and told her the building was cleared for full use. The moment was simple, but it carried a weight that reached far beyond the walls. We walked through the west wing together, sunlight spilling across the polished floors. The rooms stood ready: beds, made curtains drawn back small touches, that made each space feel lived in even before anyone had moved in. In the common room, Gloria was setting a vase of fresh flowers on the table. She looked up, her smile easy and full, and said, "It feels like home now." Over the next few days, more residents arrived. Some came with small suitcases, others with nothing but the clothes they wore. Each one was met with warmth, a room of their own, and a door they could lock. I stayed for the first week, helping people settle in, arranging furniture, sharing quiet meals. At night, the building was calm, no raised voices, no hurried footsteps, only the soft murmur of conversation from the kitchen. One evening, as I was leaving, I passed Michael in the hallway. He'd been volunteering in the workshop fixing furniture for the new residents. We exchanged a brief greeting, and though there was still distance between us, there was also a kind of peace. Some things didn't need to be mended in full to be put to rest. When the last of the rooms was filled, I stood in the garden and looked at the building. The paint was fresh, the windows clear, the garden beds growing. But it was more than that. It was a place where people could begin again without fear. That had been the goal from the start, and now it was real. I drove back to the cottage that evening with the windows down, the air warm and steady. There was no grand ending, no dramatic moment, just the quiet certainty that what we had built would last. In life, justice doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it's simply a locked door, a warm bed, and the safety to sleep through the night. If you've ever fought to reclaim something you lost, or helped someone else do the same, you know the kind of peace it can bring. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your own stories in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, consider subscribing so we can share more moments like this together.